Hi everyone, my name's Eleanor and I'm the Education Manager at Benjamin Franklin House. Welcome to this, our November history class, where we are looking at the history of the original 13 colonies in North America. As ever, we are so delighted to see you here with us today and we're looking forward to your participation during the class. A reminder that you can do this either by typing in the chat, or if you press the raise hand button, then I can unmute your microphone and hear you over the audio. So we've got a picture of the original 13 colonies here, a map showing them in 1776 when there was a Declaration of Independence and America became independent from Britain. But before we really dive into that history and remind ourselves what those 13 colonies were and how they came to be, I have a question for you. So we always start by reminding people if it might be people's first time joining the class or watching a recording online, who Benjamin Franklin was and what he was doing in London, why there is a house in London named after him. But I can see some familiar names joining us. So could anyone help us with some pointers on those questions? Thank you, Claire. So Claire has said that he was a scientist, a writer, a politician, inventor, and a founding father of America. That's probably what he's best remembered for. We can see a picture of him here. This is an illustration of him in his room at Benjamin Franklin House, although it wasn't called that then when he lived here. It's on a street called Craven Street, which is right in the centre of London. And some other people saying similar things about what Benjamin Franklin was known for. It was really his politics that brought him to London. He came here in 1757 and would stay here for about 16 years, leaving in 1775. So when he was here, he was representing the people who lived in America, the colonists as they were known, to the British King and the British government. And there was some disagreement between America and Britain during that time. Americans wanted more freedom, more independence. And so when Benjamin Franklin left London, that was when there was the War of Independence, also known as the Revolutionary War, and America broke away and became independent. But part of the goal of these classes is that we understand the history that kind of runs up to that moment of the American Revolution. Oh, brilliant. So Esther, Elijah and Talitha have said how Benjamin Franklin really worked hard to try and prevent the war, but ultimately that it wasn't going to go that way. The tensions were too high between the Americans and the British. And one of the reasons the tensions were so high is that the British were asking the Americans or the colonists to pay a lot of taxes, and yet they didn't have any elected representatives in the British government, so it seemed very unfair to them. Brilliant, thanks so much for your help, everyone. So I have got another question. In history, we'll often come across terms that we might not have heard so much before. So I wonder if you know one of the key words that we'll be using today. What do you think we mean when we say a colony? What do you think that means? So we saw on the map at the beginning some of those original colonies in North America. I can see Helen has a raised hand. Hello?
Hi. It is a big place. Big group of something, like a world.
Yeah, so it's elsewhere in the world. It's a big area of land. Brilliant, thank you so much. Let me see in the chat as well. So Claire has described it. When we're thinking about British colonies, there are other countries that had colonies as well. We're thinking about land that belongs to Britain but's not next to us. That's a good way of describing it. Esther, Elijah and Talitha have said it's when a country might send people out to start a settlement in a new country. Very good explanation. Really good, guys. Thanks so much. So let's be really clear about our definitions. I'm going to give a bit more detail about what we mean by a colony, because it's a really key word for this lesson and also for lots of history, because A lot of the last several hundred years, lots of countries, particularly countries in Europe, went out and invaded other places and then had these colonies. So it's really tied up in the foundations of how the world is today. And that's one of the reasons history is so important, because it helps us understand how things work today. So a colony is a country or an area under full or partial political control of another country. And just like you said, normally it will be quite distant to the country that's in control, and it will be occupied by settlers from that original country that gets called the mother country often. So it's also not just the space, but the group of people that inhabit that foreign territory, and they maintain those ties to the parent country. So we refer to them as the colonists when we're thinking about North America. And so the people can be considered the colony, and so can the area, the land itself. And why did countries like Britain and other countries in Europe want to kind of send people out to try and invade other countries that were, for the most part, already occupied by people? We've spoken in previous classes about how there were many Native Americans living in America. Why did Britain want to do this? Well, it was a way for them to increase power and influence, and also to get richer. So a lot of these countries would have amazing natural resources or raw materials, and then that could be traded, so exported from the colony to other countries. So we've got some comments in the chat, wanting to gain more land and resources and building an empire. Exactly, so this is all part of the idea of an empire. Brilliant participation, everyone, thank you. So my next question for you, and you might know some already, or you might have spotted some on that first map we saw, is can you name any of the original 13 colonies in North America? So we know they're all on the East Coast. They've now become states. They became states when it became the United States of America, and they became independent from Britain. So I wonder if you know any of the names of these colonies. So Claire has said Carolina, brilliant. There was North and South Carolina, which confusingly are both in the south of the colonies. Massachusetts, and then someone said Philadelphia, which is the city in Pennsylvania, which is another one. And then New England is right. That is an area of several colonies that we'll look at all the different names of those. Fantastic. So some you know some already. Let's have a look at them. So we've got another map here, which is a bit closer up. Now it's still a little hard to read, but I'm going to go through the names of the different colonies, and these are states today on the East Coast of America. So it's sort of in order, but some of the colonies are kind of next to each other rather than on top or beneath. So you've got New Hampshire, so kind of starting up here, Massachusetts, someone mentioned, Connecticut, Rhode Island, New York, and of course people might have heard of New York City, and then that's within the what was before the colony, now the state of New York. You can see that one more clearly. Actually, it's quite big in comparison to some of the smaller ones. New Jersey, Pennsylvania we mentioned, we can see that one quite clearly as well. Delaware, Maryland, and then we get to the more southern states. So you see these are quite a bit bigger. So you've got Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia as well. So those are the original 13 colonies in North America that the British invaded. And we'll be thinking about also how other Europeans had invaded previously, and there were some wars between them as well to have control over these lands and the richness, the resources that could come from them too. So we're going to go through some of these colonies or groups of colonies and think about their story, how they came to be. So if you were able to join us for the last class, which was thinking about the very first journeys the British and other Europeans made to North America, we spoke a bit about Jamestown in Virginia, but I'm going to go into more detail today. So this was the first colony that the British successfully settled and were able to keep and maintain. although that wasn't without quite significant challenges and lots of hardships faced by those early settlers in Jamestown. So we can see a diagram of Jamestown here. Initially, this triangular structure, but then it did expand as well. So it's on the James River in Virginia. So they chose the location for a few reasons, one of them being that it was lots of water, it was surrounded by water on all sides. So Jamestown was founded in May 1706. This was when the London Company, or which became known as the Virginia Company, sent people over to settle it, and they were given permission by the King of Britain at the time, which was James I. So some of the problems they ran into early on were finding it difficult to get things growing in this different country where the land was quite different. And so unfortunately, those early settlers, many of them suffered from starvation. Also diseases, some of the water wasn't very clean or very good to be drinking. So lots of diseases as well. Now, early on, when they arrived, the Native Americans that lived nearby, another reason they'd chosen the area is it wasn't currently inhabited, tried to help the British by giving them food to help them. So the local tribe was called the Powhatan tribe. But unfortunately, there came a drought a couple of years later, and the relationship between the British settlers and the Native Americans got more difficult, more tense, partly because the British were trying to ask for more and more food because there was this drought, and the Native Americans didn't have it to give to them. But then a key turning point was in 1616, so a few years later, and this is when the colonists, the settlers in Jamestown, really figured out how to get tobacco seeds to plant successfully. And then they could start growing tobacco and send this back to Britain, and this could make a lot of money for the Virginia Company, who had sent them there in the first place. So this was partly an important person in this process was someone called John Rolfe that we can see in the picture on the right of the screen. So he was someone who came to Jamestown, and he brought with him a new strain of the tobacco seeds that did better in the land in Jamestown. And so they quickly really began to produce a lot of tobacco. So that was in 1616 that they successfully started growing it. And then by 1630, Jamestown was producing over 1.5 million pounds of tobacco every year. So it was being very successful for the Virginia Company that had sent people to the area to begin with. So what this picture on the right is depicting is another important moment in the history of Jamestown, which is when James Rolfe married a Powhatan princess named Pocahontas. You might have heard her name before. And she had been captured by the colonists and had converted to Christianity, but ultimately their union helped to bring more peaceful relations between the settlers, the British settlers, and the local Native Americans, as this picture is trying to show as well. So when they successfully started growing tobacco, this was also an important moment because this really started this sense of something called mercantilism. And this was that motivation why countries like Britain and other places in Europe tried to invade territories elsewhere. They wanted to earn money from those places. Right, did the colonists get paid? Yes, so they could, it's all to do with trade. So when you produce the tobacco, then you can send it to another place where people want to smoke the tobacco and get paid for it. So the people in Virginia would have got money for that, and also the company that had sent them, the Virginia Company as well. So unfortunately, when this ability to grow more things in North America started to happen, this was when the practice of there was more demand for help with farming, so more demand for farm laborers, and this is when the practice of using enslaved laborers really began to happen. So we can see this depicted in the picture on the left. So this was in 1619, when a group of enslaved Africans were brought to Virginia and then were traded. These human beings were traded in exchange for food, in fact, which is quite astonishing to think of today, although unfortunately there is still modern day slavery, although not the slave trade as it was known then. So with more and more farming happening successfully in North America, this really made this triangular trade start to happen. So we can see this in the diagram on the right of the screen. So you had this exchange of goods. So that tobacco that was grown and other materials like whale oil, wood, silk, rice, sugar and wood, they were all sent to Europe. And then in the factories in Europe, in the later part of the 18th century, that was when there was the Industrial Revolution in Britain and in other countries in Europe. So in the factories, those raw goods would be made into things. So the sugar, for example, would be used to make all kinds of cakes and all of those kinds of things. And then they'd be sent elsewhere. And then a really difficult part of the triangular trade was that enslaved people would be taken from Africa to the colonies in North America, so both the Caribbean, the West Indies, and those colonies we spoke about already in what's modern day United States of America. Yes, it is a really awful practice, and it's it wasn't only happening in America. Unfortunately, it was happening all over the world, and this practice of going and invading other countries to really try and make money and be able to trade, unfortunately, is a big part of why that started happening on a big scale. So the European countries that invaded those places played a big part in that starting to happen. So not just Britain, also other countries like France and Holland and Spain as well. So I wonder if you know, we're in November, the month of November, and later this month, Americans will be celebrating Thanksgiving. And this holiday and celebration for Americans today actually has its origins in this early history when we're thinking about the first colonies. So I wonder if anyone knows anything about the story and what it has to do with what we're talking about today. Hi, Zach and Louis.
Hi. Is it to do with them giving thanks for successful harvest?
Yes, absolutely. Do you know which part of North America it happened in, the first Thanksgiving meal?
Jamestown.
It was close to Jamestown, but it's the next colony or area of colonies that we're going to talk about. So you're on the right track. Thanks so much. Okay, I can see some comments in the chat. Right, so yes, Claire, oh no, Esther, Elijah and Talitha have said that pilgrims were thankful to the Native Americans who helped them to grow and hunt food. And there was a big meal giving thanks to God. In Plymouth, you're right, so let's talk about how that all happened and where that happened. So someone mentioned New England earlier, and this is a kind of area of colonies, now what we call states, on the northern east coast of North America, and this was the next area that was kind of settlers went to. So in 1620, a group of Puritans, which were a particular group of people that had quite strong religious beliefs, set out from England in a very famous boat called the Mayflower. In fact, it was the 400th anniversary of this happening last year in 2020. So there were lots of kind of celebrations and things around that history as well. So it was quite a small group of Puritans originally set out in the Mayflower, about 100 people. And it took them about 2 months to sail to North America, and they arrived in Plymouth in what is modern day Massachusetts, what would become Massachusetts. And they arrived quite in the winter. They arrived in December of 1620. And very sadly, because of, like we had seen with the people in Jamestown, it was difficult to survive in this new place. Quite a lot of them died. But then those that survived, the next autumn, they had a successful harvest. So this is the autumn or fall of 1621. And that's when you had this original Thanksgiving meal. So on the left, we can see the Puritans, that later became known as the Pilgrims, setting out on the Mayflower from England. And then on the right, we can see this Thanksgiving meal where the colonists invited the Native Americans that lived nearby to join them in a meal to give thanks. And so they would have eaten things like venison, which is cooked deer, and chestnuts and cranberries, garlic, things that you could find in the local area. So that was in 1621, so 400 years ago this year. And it's then by the end of the 1600s was regularly celebrated as a holiday and still is today. So it's always the third Thursday in November. So it's going to be on the 25th of November, Thursday, 25th of November this year. And we're actually doing some special Thanksgiving themed tours at Benjamin Franklin House during that day. So if you are in London or after school or anything, then we'd love to welcome you to the house for a Thanksgiving celebration. Brilliant. So we've thought about the original colony, Jamestown in Virginia, and we've thought about the area of New England. So what came next? What were the next colonies? Well, you had the Middle Colonies. So in 1664, the British king was King Charles II, and he gave the territory between New England that we just spoke about and Virginia, where Jamestown was, to his brother, who was called James. And actually part of that area, particularly around modern day New York, was already occupied by people from the Netherlands, by the Dutch. So part of the permission, which we've actually got some interesting original sources here. So on the left, we've got the Duke of York. So that was James's name because he was the brother of the king. His charter from King Charles granting him that area. So this is the original document gifting it to him. And with that came the permission for him to go to war with the Dutch that were living there. And so they kind of recaptured the land from the Dutch. So on the right, we have a map of New Netherland, which is a sort of around modern day New York, where the people from the Netherlands had settled. So that was the Middle Colonies. And interestingly, then something happened to create Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania was unusual. We've seen so far that these colonies were owned by the crown, or so the king had to kind of give permission to people to go and invade them. But the colony of Pennsylvania is an interesting one. So there was a gentleman called William Penn, who was an admiral, and the King Charles II again, owed him quite a lot of money, about £80,000, which is a lot today and was even more in those times. And so to kind of pay him back, he gifted land in North America to the son of William Penn, who was also called William Penn, confusingly. So that's what we can see happening in this picture here. So we've got King Charles on the left, sorry. We've got King Charles II and William Penn, and he is being gifted this royal charter to take land. And of course the name Pennsylvania comes from his surname Penn, and then Sylvania comes from the Latin word for woods. So there was a lot of wood and forest in the area. So that's partly how the colony, now the state, came to have its name. And Pennsylvania is an important colony or state for our story at Benjamin Franklin House, because you may know already that Benjamin Franklin spent a lot of his life in Philadelphia in Pennsylvania. And when he first came to England, he was a colonial agent representing Pennsylvania. He'd come here to kind of negotiate with this gentleman on the right, who was Thomas Penn, who was the son of William Penn, who'd been given the land, and trying to get Thomas Penn to contribute more to the taxes that Pennsylvania were having to pay to Britain. a very interesting question. How could Charles give land that he didn't own? It's a very good question, and all of this is, it's very difficult that people were going and invading land where people lived already and taking it for their own. So it's just a very different approach to things. That was how people operated in those times, thinking that they had the right to go and do that. So then the Southern Colonies, so those included Maryland and Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. So those were then sort of invaded and taken over by the British after the Middle Colonies. And because they had the warmer climate there, this is where agriculture and again that mercantilism really took off. So you had the growth of tobacco, also sugar and cotton. And we saw that they were really big areas as well. And again, we can see that it was, unfortunately, this was fueling the slave trade, the triangular trade, and that enslaved people were forced to work in these plantations to produce these products that were making other people very wealthy, even though they were living a very difficult life. So that's the story of those original colonies and kind of briefly how they came to be. And then I'd just like to end with a suggested activity you might like to try afterwards. So we've looked at quite a lot of maps in this session, and it's really important to understand that early geography of North America, and geography is often very important in history. So my suggestion is to try and create your own map of these early 13th colonies. You might want to do one that's more zoomed out and shows the whole of the North American continent, so you can see the scale of how it was actually quite a small area of land that was invaded initially. Or you might want to kind of color code it, like in this map on the right. So you've got the New England colonies, the Middle Colonies, and the Southern Colonies as well. So I hope you might like trying that after the class, and thank you so much for joining us. Did anyone have any questions before we finish? So Esther, Elijah, and Tabitha have asked, were the different colonies from different groups of people moving out there, different trading companies? So yes, it was a real mixture. So some of it was different trading companies, like in Virginia, and then we learned a bit about how with the Mayflower, it was also to do with there being more religious freedoms in North America, whereas over history, for certain religious groups, life has sometimes been quite difficult in Britain for people with certain religious beliefs. They wouldn't be able to do things like have certain jobs or have the same rights as everyone else. So some of the colonies, the first settlers might have been of a particular religious belief, like we saw with the people who went on the Mayflower, the Puritans, who became known as the Pilgrims. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a great end of the week and hope to see you next month. Bye for now.